Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, delighted to accompany you through another tale of reason and restraint. Tell me, have you drawn the curtains yet? Is the lamplight steady beside you? On such evenings, Watson often reflected that truth reveals itself not in haste, but in the patience of careful observation. Do subscribe so you may join us regularly. Now, settle in. For as Holmes knew well, the smallest overlooked detail often holds the key. You'll find Watson's Margins on Spotify as well, link just below. Chapter 1. The Orderly House on Cavendish Square. It was during the spring of 1895 that I had occasion to witness one of the most singular investigations ever conducted by my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The case presented none of the dramatic circumstances that had characterised some of our more celebrated adventures, yet it possessed a quality of quiet unease that proved in the end far more disturbing than any scene of violence I had previously encountered. The month of April had arrived with uncommon mildness, and London had responded with that brief optimism which annually attends the first sustained warmth after winter. Our rooms in Baker Street were bathed in morning sunlight, and I had settled into my customary chair with the intention of reviewing certain medical journals that had accumulated during a particularly busy fortnight. Holmes, for his part, had spent the better portion of the week in a state of restless dissatisfaction, alternating between chemical experiments of questionable safety and prolonged sessions with his violin, during which he produced sounds that bore only the most distant relationship to melody. It was therefore with some relief that I observed, shortly before 11 o'clock, the arrival of a visitor whose card announced him as Mr. Alistair Penbury, solicitor of Lincoln's Inn Fields. The gentleman who presently entered our sitting room was perhaps 45 years of age, possessed of that particular bearing which long association with the law bestows upon its practitioners. His dress was impeccable without ostentation, his manner composed, and his features arranged in an expression of professional gravity that appeared entirely natural to him. He carried a leather portfolio beneath one arm and moved with the measured precision of a man accustomed to conducting his affairs with methodical care. Holmes, who had been examining a sample of tobacco ash with his lens, set aside his apparatus and gestured toward the chair opposite his own. "Mr. Penbury," said he, "you practice conveyancing and probate work, I perceive, and have come directly from your chambers, where you have spent the morning reviewing documents pertaining to a recently deceased client of considerable wealth and rigid habits." Our visitor, to his credit, displayed only mild surprise at this observation. "Your reputation is well deserved, Mr. Holmes," he replied, taking the offered seat, "though I confess I am at a loss to understand how you arrived at such specific conclusions." "The matter is elementary," Holmes responded with a dismissive wave. "Your portfolio bears the distinctive stamp of Furnival and Sons, stationers who supply almost exclusively to Lincoln's Inn. The slight discoloration upon your right thumb and forefinger indicates prolonged contact with legal documents of some age, whilst the faint impression upon your waistcoat suggests you have recently leaned against a desk scattered with papers requiring careful organisation. As for your specialty, the particular quality of ink upon your cuff suggests the sort of heavy vellum employed in testamentary instruments. That your client is deceased follows naturally from your evident purpose in consulting a private detective, and his wealth may be inferred from your presence here at all, for you are clearly a man whose time is valuable. The rigid habits I deduce from the punctuality of your arrival, precisely at the hour you specified in your note, combined with a certain formality in your bearing that suggests long association with a client of similar temperament." Mr. Penbury nodded slowly, a faint smile crossing his features. "Your deductions are entirely accurate, Mr. Holmes. I come to you regarding the estate of Sir Lionel March, who passed from this life 10 days ago at his residence in Cavendish Square. Sir Lionel was indeed a gentleman of considerable means, and, as you surmise, of most particular habits." "The name is familiar to me," Holmes remarked. "A widower, I believe, who made his fortune in railway investments during the great expansion of the 50s and 60s, a man noted for discretion in his dealings and a certain austere quality in his personal life." Your knowledge is comprehensive, our visitor replied. Sir Lionel was precisely as you describe. He lived quietly, maintained few social connections, and conducted his affairs with an attention to detail that bordered upon the obsessive. He was not, I must confess, a man who inspired warmth, yet he commanded respect through the absolute integrity of his word and the methodical nature of his arrangements. And his death? Holmes inquired, his fingers forming that familiar steeple beneath his chin that indicated awakening interest. Certified as heart failure by his physician, Dr. Halverson, who had attended him for many years. Sir Lionel was 73 years of age, and whilst his constitution had remained sound, the inevitable effects of advancing years had begun to manifest themselves. The end came peacefully, or so it appeared. He had retired to his study on the evening of the 23rd of March, having dismissed his household staff at their usual hour. He was discovered the following morning, seated at his desk, having evidently passed during the night without struggle or disturbance. A natural conclusion, one would think, I observed. What then brings you to seek Mr. Holmes's assistance? Mr. Penbury extracted a document from his portfolio and regarded it for a moment before speaking. The difficulty, gentlemen, lies not in the manner of Sir Lionel's death, but in certain irregularities that have emerged during the administration of his estate. As his solicitor of more than 20 years' standing, I was intimately familiar with his testamentary arrangements. Among his papers was maintained what he termed his probate ledger, a private record in which he kept detailed annotations regarding his various beneficiaries, charitable intentions, and certain personal observations that informed his decisions. A common enough practice among men of substantial means, Holmes noted. Indeed. However, this particular ledger has proven to be missing. It was kept, to my certain knowledge, in the locked drawer of his study desk, to which only Sir Lionel himself possessed the key. That key was found upon his person following his death. The drawer was secure, yet the ledger itself has vanished. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his grey eyes sharpening with interest. You have, I presume, conducted a thorough search. Most thorough, Mr. Holmes. The entire study has been examined with meticulous care, as have all other rooms in the house. The ledger has simply disappeared. And the household, who had access to Sir Lionel's study? That is perhaps the most curious aspect of the matter. The household is small, and to all appearances entirely trustworthy. There is Miss Eleanor March, Sir Lionel's niece and sole heir, who kept his house and attended to his comfort with dutiful regularity. There is Mr. Edwin March, a distant cousin of modest means who occasionally visited and who had received certain financial assistance from Sir Lionel. Mrs. Corbett, the housekeeper, has been in service for more than 15 years and is a woman of unblemished character. Dr. Halverson, as I have mentioned, was Sir Lionel's physician and trusted friend, and there is myself who handled all legal matters and was present at the house on several occasions during the final week of Sir Lionel's life. A small circle indeed, Holmes murmured, and all, I take it, have been most cooperative in your inquiries. Perfectly so, Mr. Holmes. That is what troubles me most profoundly. There is no atmosphere of suspicion, no hint of discord, no evidence of concealment. Each member of the household has expressed concern regarding the missing document and has facilitated every aspect of the search. Yet the ledger remains absent, and its contents were of such a nature that their revelation could materially affect the distribution of a very considerable fortune. Holmes rose and stood before the window, his hands clasped behind his back, while gazing down into Baker Street. "You intrigue me, Mr. Penbury," said he at length. "Not because of what you have told me, but because of what you have not said. You are a man trained in the law, accustomed to evidence and procedure, yet you come to me with a case that presents no clear crime, no obvious suspect, and no apparent urgency. Why?" Our visitor was silent for a moment, choosing his words with evident care. "Because, Mr. Holmes, in all my years of practice, I have never encountered such perfect composure in the face of such significant uncertainty. It is as though the entire household has accepted the ledger's disappearance as an unfortunate but unremarkable occurrence. There is cooperation without anxiety, concern without fear, and that, I confess, strikes me as most unnatural." Holmes turned from the window, and I observed upon his features that expression of keen attention that invariably preceded his acceptance of a case. "You are quite right, Mr. Penbury," he said quietly. "When human nature behaves contrary to its established patterns, there is invariably something worth investigating. I shall take your case. Watson, I trust you are free to accompany me to Cavendish Square?" "Entirely at your disposal," I replied, already reaching for my hat. Thus began our involvement in an affair that would prove to test Holmes's methods in ways neither of us could have anticipated, and which would ultimately reveal truths far more complex than the simple matter of a missing document. Chapter 2. The Blameless Circle. The journey to Cavendish Square occupied little more than 20 minutes, during which Holmes remained largely silent, his brow furrowed in that particular manner which indicated active contemplation. Mr. Penbury, seated opposite us in the hansom, ventured occasional remarks regarding the disposition of Sir Lionel's property, but my friend appeared scarcely to hear them, his gaze fixed upon some point beyond the cab window. March House proved to be a substantial Georgian residence of 4 stories, its facade presenting that air of quiet prosperity which characterises the better class of London dwelling. The windows were clean to the point of severity, the brass fittings gleamed with recent polishing, and the very stones of the entrance steps appeared to have been individually attended to. Even the iron railings exhibited a uniformity of maintenance that suggested regular and methodical care. We were admitted by Mrs. Corbet herself, a woman of perhaps 50 years whose appearance perfectly complemented the house she evidently managed with such efficiency. Her dress was sober without being austere, her manner respectful without servility, and her features composed in an expression of professional courtesy that revealed nothing of her inner thoughts. "Mr. Penbury, gentlemen," said she, taking our cards with a brief glance. "Miss March is expecting you in the morning-room. Dr. Halverson has also arrived, as you requested." The interior of March House maintained the standard established by its exterior. As we followed Mrs. Corbet through the entrance hall, I observed that every surface bore evidence of scrupulous attention. The mahogany furnishings gleamed with polish, the oriental carpet showed no sign of wear, and even the air itself seemed to possess an unusual quality of stillness, as though the very atmosphere had been disciplined into submission. The morning room into which we were shown faced south, and received considerable light, yet somehow failed to achieve any sense of warmth. The furniture, though undoubtedly of good quality, had been arranged with such geometric precision as to discourage comfortable occupation. A fire burned in the grate with reluctant efficiency, providing heat without cheer. 3 persons awaited us within. The first to rise was Miss Eleanor March, a woman of perhaps 30 years whose appearance struck me immediately as remarkable, not for any particular feature, but for the absolute composure of her bearing. She was dressed in mourning of impeccable cut, her dark hair arranged with careful simplicity, and her face possessed of a pale, regular beauty that seemed somehow diminished by the very perfection of her self-control. "Mr. Penbury," said she, extending her hand briefly to our companion before turning to Holmes and myself. "And you must be Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson. You're welcome to March House, though I confess I remain uncertain as to the necessity of your involvement." Her voice carried no hostility, merely a statement of fact delivered with the same measured precision that characterized her entire presentation. "Miss March is naturally concerned that any suggestion of irregularity might reflect poorly upon her uncle's memory," Mr. Penbury interjected smoothly. "I have assured her that Mr. Holmes's discretion is absolute." The second occupant of the room now came forward. He was a man of approximately 40 years, slight of build and somewhat diffident in manner, with thinning hair and features that suggested habitual anxiety imperfectly concealed. "Mr. Edwin March," said our solicitor by way of introduction, "a cousin of Sir Lionel, who has been most helpful during this difficult period." Too kind," murmured Edwin March, shaking hands with evident nervousness. "A terrible business, naturally. Poor Uncle Lionel. Though of course at his age one must expect. That is to say, the natural course of things, but still most distressing." The third member of our party required no introduction, for I recognised Dr. Halverson immediately from his occasional contributions to the medical journals. He was a man of commanding presence, perhaps 60 years of age, with iron grey hair and the sort of penetrating gaze that comes from long practice in diagnostic observation. "Mr. Holmes," said he, inclining his head slightly, "your reputation precedes you. I trust, however, that this matter will prove to be nothing more than a minor administrative confusion. Sir Lionel's death was entirely natural, I assure you. I had attended him through several minor complaints over the past year, and whilst his heart had shown some weakness, there was nothing to suggest imminent danger." "I do not doubt your professional judgment, Doctor," Holmes replied evenly. "My interest lies not in the medical facts, but in certain surrounding circumstances which Mr. Penbury has found puzzling." We took our seats, and for several moments an awkward silence prevailed. It was Holmes who broke it, addressing Miss March directly. "I wonder, Miss March, if you might describe for me the events of the evening preceding your uncle's death. I understand the household retired at the customary hour?" Eleanor March nodded, her hands folded precisely in her lap. "Uncle Lionel maintained strict household routines, Mr. Holmes. Dinner was served at 7 o'clock invariably. On that particular evening he dined alone, as was his habit when he had no guests. I took my own meal in my sitting room, as I often did. At 9 o'clock he dismissed the staff and retired to his study, as he did every evening without fail. He preferred not to be disturbed after that hour." "And you did not see him again that evening?" "I did not. I retired to my own rooms shortly after 10 o'clock and saw nothing unusual." "The study," Holmes continued. "I understand it overlooks the square?" "It does. A corner room on the ground floor facing both south and east." "And yet Mr. Penbury mentioned that a window was found slightly ajar the following morning, despite the cold weather that week." A flicker of something crossed Eleanor March's features, too brief to identify with certainty. "That is correct. I noticed it myself when I found him. It struck me as unusual, but I assumed he must have desired fresh air during the night." Holmes made no immediate reply, but turned his attention to Edwin March. "And you, sir, when did you last see your cousin?" Edwin March shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I had called upon Uncle Lionel 3 days prior to his death, Mr. Holmes. A brief visit, purely social. He was in his usual health, though perhaps somewhat preoccupied. We spoke for perhaps 20 minutes, and then I took my leave. I learned of his death through a message from Mr. Penbury." "You were not a frequent visitor to this house?" "No, sir. Uncle Lionel valued his privacy. I called perhaps once every few months, and only when invited or when business made it necessary." "Business?" Again that uncomfortable shifting. "Uncle Lionel had been kind enough to assist me with certain financial difficulties some months ago. I had occasion to express my gratitude during that final visit." Holmes's gaze moved to Dr. Halverson. "And you, Doctor? When did you last attend Sir Lionel?" "I had examined him 2 weeks before his death," Halverson replied crisply. "A routine consultation. I found his general health satisfactory for a man of his years, though I recommended certain modifications to his habits: reduced exertion, moderation in dietary matters, adequate rest. He was not, I must say, particularly receptive to such advice. He maintained that discipline of mind and routine of habit were superior to any medical prescription. A man of firm convictions, evidently. Exceptionally so, Mr. Holmes. Sir Lionel did not tolerate deviation from established order, whether in his household or in his own conduct." Holmes rose and walked slowly about the room, his keen eyes taking in every detail of its furnishing and arrangement. "I should like to examine the study, if I may," said he presently, "and perhaps Mrs. Corbett might join us. Her perspective as one intimately familiar with the household routines would be valuable." "Certainly," Eleanor March replied, arising with fluid grace. Though I assure you, Mr. Holmes, you will find everything in perfect order. Mrs. Corbett has maintained the room exactly as Uncle Lionel left it." As we made our way toward the study, I observed Holmes's expression with the familiarity of long association. He was troubled, though not in the manner one might expect. There was no animation, no eager anticipation of the hunt. Rather, he appeared to be contemplating some puzzle that defied conventional categories. Later, when we had a moment alone in the corridor, I ventured to ask what impression the household had made upon him. "A most remarkable one, Watson," he replied quietly. "Have you ever encountered a circle of individuals so perfectly cooperative, so entirely reasonable, and yet so utterly devoid of genuine feeling? They speak of Sir Lionel with respect, yet without affection. They describe his death with appropriate solemnity, yet without grief. They assist our inquiries with complete willingness, yet without any apparent anxiety regarding the outcome." "Perhaps they are simply people of reserved temperament," I suggested. "Reserved? Yes. But there is something more, Watson, something I cannot yet articulate. It is as though each of them is performing a role with letter-perfect accuracy, whilst the actual drama unfolds somewhere beyond our observation." We had reached the study door. Holmes paused with his hand upon the knob, his profile sharp against the dim light of the corridor. "They are hiding something, Watson, not individually, but collectively, and until I understand what that something is, we shall make no progress in this singular affair." With that, he opened the door and we stepped into the chamber where Sir Lionel March had breathed his last. Chapter 3. The Incident Reconsidered. The study of Sir Lionel March was a chamber that spoke eloquently of its former occupant's character. It was a room of moderate proportions, panelled in dark oak, with two tall windows set at right angles to one another in the corner formation that Eleanor March had described. The furnishings were substantial but austere, consisting principally of a large desk positioned to command a view of both aspects, several capacious bookcases filled with volumes of legal and financial reference, and a pair of leather chairs arranged before the fireplace with mathematical symmetry. What struck me most forcibly, however, was the oppressive orderliness of the place. Now, every book stood in precise alignment with its neighbours, every paper upon the desk lay at exact right angles to the edge, and even the coal scuttle beside the hearth had been positioned with what appeared to be deliberate calculation. It was a room that forbade spontaneity, a space designed to impose discipline upon thought itself. Holmes stood for several moments in the doorway, his eyes moving slowly across the chamber, absorbing details with that peculiar intensity of focus which characterized his methods. Mrs. Corbett had joined us, and now stood with her hands folded before her, awaiting whatever questions might be directed her way. "The window, Mrs. Corbett," Holmes said at length, crossing to the eastward-facing casement. "You discovered it open on the morning of Sir Lionel's death." "Not open, sir, but unlatched. Yet the sash was lowered, but the catch had not been secured. It moved perhaps an inch in the breeze, which was how I noticed it when I entered to light the fire. And this was unusual?" "Most unusual, Mr. Holmes. Sir Lionel was particular about such matters. He insisted that all windows be properly fastened before the household retired. The night of March 23rd was notably cold, and he would never have tolerated draughts in his study." Holmes examined the window mechanism with care, testing the catch and studying the frame. "The window operates smoothly," he observed. "No stiffness, no difficulty in manipulation. A person unfamiliar with this particular casement would have no trouble securing it properly." "None whatsoever, sir. I've operated it myself on countless occasions." My friend moved to the desk, where he stood regarding the surface with that absolute stillness which indicated profound concentration. Upon the leather writing surface sat an inkstand of heavy crystal, a blotter of green felt, and several items of correspondence arranged in a neat stack. A mahogany writing box occupied one corner, its lid closed. "Sir Lionel worked at this desk on the evening of his death?" Holmes inquired. "I believe so, sir," Mrs. Corbett replied. It was his invariable custom to spend an hour or more attending to his papers after dismissing the staff. And the following morning, when you discovered him, the desk was arranged as we see it now? Precisely so, Mr. Holmes. Nothing has been disturbed since that morning, save for the removal of Sir Lionel's person by the undertaker and the subsequent examination of the drawer where the ledger was kept. Holmes opened the writing box, revealing an interior fitted with compartments for various sizes of stationery. Each compartment was fully stocked, the papers aligned with geometric precision. "The inkstand," said Holmes suddenly, lifting the crystal vessel and holding it to the light. "When was it last filled?" Mrs. Corbett appeared momentarily surprised by the question. "I attend to the inkstand every Monday without fail, sir. It was filled on the 20th of March, 3 days before Sir Lionel's death. And he wrote regularly. Daily correspondence, entries in various records." "Every evening, sir." "Sir Lionel maintained extensive documentation of his affairs." Holmes removed the stopper and peered into the reservoir, then replaced it thoughtfully. "Dr. Watson," said he, "your medical opinion, if you please. A man of 73 years, seated at his desk, suffers sudden heart failure. What position would you expect to find the body in upon discovery?" I considered the question carefully. "That would depend upon the nature of the seizure," I replied. "A massive cardiac event would likely cause the victim to collapse forward across the desk, or possibly to fall from the chair entirely. A less severe but ultimately fatal episode might leave him slumped in his seat, though some disarrangement would be inevitable." "And yet Sir Lionel was found seated upright in his chair, was he not, Mrs. Corbett?" The housekeeper nodded. He appeared to have simply fallen asleep, sir. His head was inclined slightly backward against the chair rest. His hands were folded upon the desk before him." Dr. Halverson commented upon the peacefulness of his aspect. "No disarrangement of papers? No signs of distress?" "None that I could observe, Mr. Holmes." My friend turned to the windows once more, his hands clasped behind his back. "Walk me through your discovery, Mrs. Corbett. Every detail, if you please, precisely as it occurred." The housekeeper drew a measured breath before responding. "I entered the study at 7 o'clock in the morning, as was my custom, to light the fire and open the curtains. Sir Lionel was always punctual in his habits, and I expected to find the room empty, as he typically rose at 6:30 and breakfasted at 7. Instead, I found him seated at his desk in the position I have described. I spoke his name, but received no response. I approached and perceived immediately that he had passed during the night." "You did not touch anything?" "Only to ascertain that he was indeed deceased, sir. I placed my fingers briefly upon his wrist. The flesh was quite cold. I then withdrew and sent for Dr. Halverson immediately." "And the decanter?" Holmes indicated a cut-glass vessel, standing upon a small table between the 2 leather chairs. It contained perhaps 3 fingers of port, unstoppered. "Sir Lionel occasionally took a glass of port before retiring," Mrs. Corbett explained. "He must have poured it that evening, but neglected to drink it." "That too was unusual?" "I could not say, sir. I was not present during his private hours." Holmes crossed to the fireplace and knelt to examine the grate. The ashes had been cleaned away, but he ran his fingers along the interior surfaces with methodical thoroughness. "The fire was laid but not lit that evening?" he asked. "Correct, sir. The weather had turned quite cold, but Sir Lionel often preferred to work without a fire, claiming it sharpened his concentration." Rising, Holmes moved to the bookcases, scanning the spines with apparent aimlessness. Yet I knew from long experience that nothing in his examination was random. Each observation fed into some larger pattern of understanding that remained, for the moment, invisible to my own faculties. "The locked drawer, Mrs. Corbett. You stated that Sir Lionel alone possessed the key?" "Yes, sir. He wore it upon his watch chain." "Always?" "Mr. Penbury recovered it when he came to view the body and assess the estate." "And the drawer was locked when the key was employed?" "It was, sir. Mr. Penbury unlocked it himself in my presence. The drawer contained various documents and folders, but the ledger that should have been there was absent." Holmes returned to the desk and opened the drawer in question. It was deep and well constructed, fitted with a substantial lock mechanism. He examined its interior with his lens, paying particular attention to the corners and the underside of the drawer above. "Dust," he murmured, more to himself than to us, or rather, the absence of dust where one would expect to find it. He straightened and addressed Mrs. Corbett directly. "One final question. In the weeks preceding his death, did you observe any change in Sir Lionel's habits or demeanour? Any deviation from his established routines?" The housekeeper considered this with evident care. "Sir Lionel was not a man given to variation, Mr. Holmes. However, in the final week of his life, I did notice that he spent longer hours in his study than was typical. He also requested that certain household accounts be brought to him for review, which was unusual as he generally left such matters to my discretion." "What manner of accounts?" "Expenditures for the past year, sir. Servants' wages, household provisions, maintenance costs. I provided him with a complete summary, which he studied with great attention." "And did he comment upon these figures?" "Only to acknowledge their receipt, sir. He made no criticism and requested no explanation." Holmes nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Mrs. Corbett. You have been most helpful." After the housekeeper had withdrawn, I ventured to ask what conclusions my friend had drawn from his examination. "Conclusions would be premature, Watson," he replied, still gazing about the study. "However, certain observations present themselves. First, we have a man of rigid habits who dies peacefully in his study, yet leaves a window improperly secured on a cold evening. Second, we have an inkstand that should contain ink sufficient for several days' writing, yet appears remarkably depleted. Third, we have a decanter of port poured, but not consumed. Fourth, we have a body positioned with almost theatrical precision. And fifth, we have papers arranged upon a desk with such exactitude that one might suspect they were placed there with deliberate intent rather than left in the natural disorder of active use. You believe the scene was arranged? I believe, Watson, that we are meant to see a peaceful natural death, and whenever a scene invites such ready interpretation, I become deeply suspicious. The question is not whether Sir Lionel died of heart failure. That much may well be true. The question is whether the circumstances surrounding that death occurred precisely as they have been presented to us." He stood silent for a moment longer, then turned toward the door. "Come, Watson. We have seen what we were meant to see. Now we must discover what we were meant to overlook." Chapter 4. Motives in Quiet Disguise. The following afternoon found us once again at March House, though this time Holmes had requested individual audiences with each member of the household. Mr. Penbury had arranged matters with his customary efficiency, and we had been provided with the use of a small drawing-room on the first floor where we might conduct our interviews in relative privacy. It was Eleanor March who came to us first, entering with that same measured grace that characterized her every movement. She seated herself without invitation, her posture erect, her hands folded in her lap with perfect composure. "Mr. Holmes," said she, "I confess I remain uncertain as to the purpose of these continued inquiries. My uncle died of natural causes. A ledger has been misplaced, and whilst the latter is regrettable, I cannot see how it constitutes a matter requiring detective investigation." Holmes regarded her with that penetrating gaze which had discomfited so many witnesses before her. "The ledger, Miss March, was not merely misplaced. It was removed from a locked drawer to which only your uncle possessed the key. That suggests deliberation rather than accident." "Then perhaps Uncle Lionel moved it himself before his death." "That is certainly one possibility. Tell me, Miss March, were you familiar with the contents of this ledger?" A slight hesitation, barely perceptible, before she replied. "I knew of its existence, naturally. Uncle Lionel made no secret of maintaining such records. As to the specific contents, I was not privy to them. And yet you stood to inherit his entire estate. Did it not concern you that your inheritance might be subject to conditions you had not been informed of?" For the first time, a faint colour rose in Eleanor March's pale cheeks. "My uncle's affairs were his own to manage as he saw fit, Mr. Holmes. I asked nothing of him beyond the privilege of keeping his house, If he chose to attach conditions to his bequests, that was entirely within his rights. A remarkably philosophical attitude, Holmes observed. Most prospective heirs would display greater curiosity, if not anxiety, regarding their expectations. Most prospective heirs, Mr. Holmes, have not spent 10 years in my uncle's household. I learned early that curiosity regarding his private matters was neither welcomed nor rewarded. You found his authority oppressive then. Eleanor March rose and walked to the window, her back to us as she spoke. I found it absolute, Mr. Holmes. My uncle was not a cruel man, but neither was he a warm one. He offered me a home when my parents died, and in return he expected perfect compliance with his standards of behaviour and household management. I provided that compliance. Whether I found it oppressive is immaterial to our present discussion. Holmes allowed a moment of silence to extend before posing his next question. The night of his death, Miss March, you stated that you retired to your rooms at 10 o'clock. Did you hear anything unusual? Any sound from the study below? Nothing, Mr. Holmes. My rooms are at the rear of the house, and the study walls are thick. I heard nothing until Mrs. Corbett knocked upon my door the following morning with the dreadful news. After Eleanor March had departed, Holmes sat in contemplative silence for several minutes before summoning Edwin March. The cousin entered with evident nervousness, his hands betraying a slight tremor as he took his seat. Mr. March, Holmes began without preamble, I understand that Sir Lionel provided you with substantial financial assistance some months ago. Edwin March's face flushed deeply. He did, sir. I had made certain unfortunate investments and found myself in temporary difficulties. Uncle Lionel was kind enough to settle the matter. I am deeply grateful for his generosity. How substantial were these difficulties? The flush deepened. The sum involved was £3,000, Mr. Holmes. A considerable amount, I know, but Uncle Lionel assured me that he expected no repayment. He said only that I should conduct my affairs with greater prudence in future. And yet you visited him 3 days before his death. Was that visit related to this debt? Only to express my continued gratitude, sir. I wished to assure him that I had indeed reformed my habits and was managing my affairs with greater care. How did he respond to these assurances? Edwin March hesitated, choosing his words with visible care. He seemed pleased, Mr. Holmes, though it was difficult to judge with certainty. Uncle Lionel was not demonstrative. He acknowledged my words and said that time would reveal whether my reformation was genuine. He then suggested that I should call upon him again in 6 months, at which point we would review my progress. Did he mention the ledger during this conversation? No, sir, and I knew nothing of any ledger until Mr. Penbury mentioned its absence. And you have no knowledge of its current whereabouts? None whatsoever, Mr. Holmes. I swear it upon my honour. After Edwin March had withdrawn, I ventured to observe that the man appeared genuinely distressed. Appearance and reality, Watson, are not always coincident, Holmes replied. Edwin March is certainly distressed, but whether from guilt or merely from natural anxiety in the face of official inquiry remains to be determined. What interests me more is the pattern that begins to emerge. Sir Lionel possessed the ability to provide or withhold financial security. That is a form of power, Watson, and power invariably creates dependency. Dr. Halverson arrived punctually at the appointed hour, declining the offer of a chair and standing instead with his back to the fireplace. "Mr. Holmes," said he, his tone carrying a hint of impatience, "I have patients awaiting me. I trust this interview will be brief." "As brief as candour permits, Doctor." "I am interested in Sir Lionel's health during the final weeks of his life. You stated that you found his condition satisfactory, yet you recommended certain modifications to his routine." "His heart showed signs of strain, nothing more. At his age, such findings are unremarkable. I recommended moderate exercise, reduced stimulation, adequate rest. Standard advice for a man of his years." "And he rejected this advice?" "He listened politely and ignored it entirely, as I suspected he would. Sir Lionel believed that mental discipline could overcome physical limitation. I disagreed but was powerless to compel his compliance. This must have frustrated you, as his physician. Halverson's expression hardened. My role is to advise, Mr. Holmes, not to command. I fulfilled that role to the best of my ability. If Sir Lionel chose to disregard sound medical counsel, that was his prerogative. Did you warn him of the potential consequences? Of course. I told him plainly that continued stress and irregular habits might precipitate exactly the sort of cardiac event that ultimately claimed him. He thanked me for my concern and showed me to the door. You were not surprised, then, when you received word of his death? I was saddened but not surprised, Mr. Holmes. The human heart has its limitations, and Sir Lionel had reached his. After the doctor's departure, Holmes requested a few moments alone. When Mrs. Corbett appeared, he greeted her with particular courtesy and asked her to describe her son's current circumstances. The housekeeper's composure wavered for the first time. My son, Mr. Holmes? I fail to see what relevance. Indulge me, Mrs. Corbett. Mr. Penbury has informed me that your son encountered certain legal difficulties several years ago. I wonder if Sir Lionel took an interest in the matter. Mrs. Corbett's hands tightened upon one another. My son was accused of theft from his employer, Mr. Holmes. The charges were ultimately dismissed, but his reputation suffered greatly. Sir Lionel was kind enough to provide him with a position in one of his railway offices, where he has served faithfully ever since. A generous gesture. More than generous, sir. It saved my son from ruin. And yet such generosity creates obligation, does it not? I have always fulfilled my duties in this household to the absolute best of my ability, Mr. Holmes. Whatever gratitude I owe Sir Lionel, I have repaid through my service. I do not doubt it, Mrs. Corbett. But tell me, did Sir Lionel ever reference this obligation? Did he ever suggest that your son's position depended upon your continued loyalty? The housekeeper's face had gone quite pale. He did not need to suggest it, Mr. Holmes. The understanding was implicit. Sir Lionel never threatened, never coerced. He simply made the reality of one's dependence abundantly clear. When we were alone once more, I remarked to Holmes that each interview had revealed the same underlying pattern. Precisely, Watson. Sir Lionel March controlled these people not through affection, or even through direct coercion, but through the far more subtle mechanism of conditional benevolence. Eleanor received shelter and status. Edwin received financial rescue. Mrs. Corbett's son received employment. Dr. Halverson received, I suspect, a steady income from attending to a wealthy patient who ignored his advice. And Penbury? Ah, yes. The solicitor remains to be questioned, though I suspect we shall find the same pattern there. Sir Lionel dealt in dependencies, Watson. He created situations where others required his favour, and then maintained that favour on terms of absolute compliance with his standards. Surely that does not make him unique among wealthy men. No, but it does create a household in which every member has something to lose. When motive is abundant, Watson, it ceases to guide our investigation. Instead, it obscures it. We must look elsewhere for our solution. Where would you suggest we look? Holmes rose and began to pace the small drawing room. At the one thing that does not fit the pattern, my dear fellow. The missing ledger. If Sir Lionel controlled his dependents through the threat of withdrawn favour, that ledger represented the instrument of his control. Its contents would reveal who owed what, who had been forgiven, who remained under obligation. Such a document would be invaluable to him. He would guard it jealously. Then why has it disappeared? That, Watson, is the question upon which this entire affair turns. And until we answer it, we remain precisely where Sir Lionel March intended us to be, surrounded by motives, yet unable to identify a crime. Chapter 5. The Language of Conscience. Over the course of the next several days, Holmes adopted a strategy that initially puzzled me, though I had learned through long association to trust his methods, even when their purpose remained obscure. Rather than pursuing the missing ledger through conventional inquiry or physical search, He instead devoted his attention to what he termed the architecture of conversation. We visited March House each afternoon, and on each occasion Holmes engaged the various members of the household in discussions that appeared, on the surface, to have little connection to our investigation. He spoke with Eleanor March about her uncle's collection of railway memoranda. He discussed with Edwin March the intricacies of certain investment schemes. He conversed with Mrs. Corbett regarding household management in substantial London residences. With Dr. Halverson, he debated recent advances in cardiac medicine. It was only upon our return to Baker Street each evening that the purpose of these seemingly aimless exchanges became apparent. Holmes would settle into his chair, close his eyes, and reconstruct entire conversations from memory, occasionally asking me to record particular phrases or hesitations in my notebook. "You see, Watson," he explained on the third evening of this peculiar routine, "we've exhausted the possibilities of physical evidence. The study reveals only what it was meant to reveal. The household yields no incriminating objects, no hidden documents, no betraying traces. Yeah, and we must therefore turn our attention to evidence of a different nature." "And what nature might that be?" I inquired. "The language of conscience, my dear fellow. When a man conceals the truth, he does so not merely through what he says, but through what he cannot bring himself to say. Each of our subjects speaks fluently about the past, yet becomes curiously constrained when discussion turns toward the future. They describe Sir Lionel's habits with precision, yet struggle to characterize the man himself. They cooperate with our investigation, yet none has asked the question that any innocent person would naturally pose." "What question is that?" "Who do you suspect, Mr. Holmes?" That is what an innocent person asks when confronted with mysterious circumstances. Yet not one member of this household has posed that query. They assist. They answer. They provide information with admirable completeness. But they do not ask who might be guilty, because each of them already knows the answer. You believe they are protecting someone? Holmes opened his eyes and regarded me with an expression of unusual gravity. "I believe they are protecting themselves, Watson. Not individually, but collectively. There is a shared knowledge in that house, a common understanding that dare not be spoken aloud. And until we determine what that understanding is, we shall make no progress." The following afternoon, Holmes requested that Eleanor March show us the upper floors of the house, claiming an interest in Sir Lionel's personal effects. As we toured the austere bedchamber and adjacent dressing room, Holmes engaged her in what seemed casual conversation. "Your uncle never remarried after his wife's death," he observed, examining a photograph of a severe-looking woman that stood upon the dresser. "That was, I believe, some 20 years ago?" 22 years, Mr. Holmes. I was 8 years old when Aunt Constance died. I remember her only vaguely." "And Sir Lionel never contemplated taking another wife?" Eleanor's response came after a pause that was fractionally too long. "He did not. He said once that he had fulfilled his matrimonial obligations and had no desire to repeat the experience. An unusual phrasing. Obligations rather than joys or companionship. Uncle Lionel viewed most relationships as matters of duty and reciprocal obligation, Mr. Holmes. Sentiment did not factor prominently in his calculations. Yet he took you in when your parents died. Surely that was an act of family feeling. It was an act of responsibility. I was his niece. I had no other relations, and propriety demanded that he provide for me. He did so. But he made it clear that I was to earn my keep through useful service to his household." Holmes turned from his examination of a wardrobe to face her directly. "When you speak of the future, Miss March, you use the conditional tense. You say you would like to travel, you might reside in the country, you could pursue certain interests. Yet you're now a woman of independent means with no obligations to constrain your choices. Why this persistent uncertainty?" The colour drained from Eleanor March's face, and for a moment I thought she might refuse to answer. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I do not yet know what the ledger contained, Mr. Holmes. I do not know what conditions my uncle may have attached to his bequests. Until that document is found, I cannot speak of the future with any confidence, for I do not know if I truly possess one." It was the first genuine emotion we had witnessed from her, and Holmes acknowledged it with a slight inclination of his head. "Thank you, Miss March. That was honestly said." Edwin March proved equally revealing, though in a different manner. Holmes encountered him in the library that same afternoon, ostensibly reviewing certain business papers. The conversation began with financial matters, but gradually shifted to more personal territory. "You must be relieved," Holmes remarked, "to have settled your debts and resumed a more stable footing." "Indeed, Mr. Holmes. Uncle Lionel's generosity quite literally saved me from ruin. I cannot adequately express my gratitude." "And yet you express it repeatedly. In every conversation we have had, you return to this theme of gratitude, emphasizing it with almost compulsive frequency." Edwin March set down the papers he had been holding, his hands trembling slightly. "Is it so strange that I should be grateful?" "Not strange, but perhaps excessive. Gratitude, once expressed, need not be perpetually reiterated, unless, of course, one fears that it might be called into question." "I don't understand what you are suggesting, Mr. Holmes." "I am suggesting nothing, Mr. March. I am merely observing that you speak of your uncle's kindness in the same manner that one speaks of a debt not fully discharged. You emphasize your gratitude because you are not entirely certain that you have earned your absolution." Edwin March rose abruptly and walked to the window, his back to us. "Uncle Lionel forgave the debt, Mr. Holmes. He said as much. But he also made it clear that forgiveness was conditional upon my continued good behaviour. He did not threaten. He never threatened. But the implication was unmistakable. If I should lapse, if I should disappoint him, the matter could be revisited. And the ledger would contain a record of this arrangement? I assume so. I cannot know for certain, but yes, I imagine it would." Holmes found Mrs. Corbett in the still room, attending to the household linens with her characteristic efficiency. She received us with polite formality, though I detected a wariness in her manner that had not been present in earlier encounters. "Mrs. Corbett," Holmes began, "you have served in this household for 15 years with apparently perfect satisfaction. Yet in all our conversations you have never once spoken of your feelings regarding Sir Lionel's death. You describe the event, you recount the circumstances, but you express no grief, no sense of loss." The housekeeper's hands stilled in their work. "I am not given to displays of emotion, Mr. Holmes. I do not speak of displays, but of simple human feeling. Did you not regard Sir Lionel with some degree of affection after so many years of service?" Mrs. Corbett met his gaze steadily. "I regarded Sir Lionel with respect, Mr. Holmes. He was a fair employer who paid promptly and made his expectations clear. But affection? No. One does not feel affection for a creditor, and that is what Sir Lionel was to me. Not in monetary terms, but in terms of obligation. My son's position, his future, his very redemption from past mistakes, all of these depended upon Sir Lionel's continued favour. I served him well because I had no choice but to serve him well, and if he were to withdraw that favour, then my son would be ruined, Mr. Holmes, and I along with him. That was the unspoken understanding that governed every day of my service in this house." When we departed that evening, Holmes was silent until we had travelled some distance from Cavendish Square. Finally he turned to me with an expression of troubled contemplation. "Do you begin to see it, Watson? The pattern that emerges from these conversations?" "Each of them lived in a state of perpetual uncertainty," I replied. "Each depended upon Sir Lionel's favour, yet none could be entirely confident that such favour was secure." "Precisely. And more than that, each of them has revealed, through careful listening, a particular preoccupation. Eleanor fears the future because she cannot control it. Edwin emphasizes gratitude because he doubts its sufficiency. Mrs. Corbett speaks of obligation because she resents its weight. Dr. Halverson, whom I questioned this morning while you were reviewing your notes, displays controlled irritation because his professional judgment was consistently disregarded. They all had reason to wish Sir Lionel dead. No, Watson. They had reason to wish themselves free. There is a distinction, and it is crucial. None of them, I'm convinced, actively desired Sir Lionel's death. What they desired was release from the subtle tyranny of his conditional benevolence, and therein lies the key to understanding what occurred in that study. You believe one of them acted to secure that release? Holmes did not answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of uncertainty I'd rarely heard from him. I believe, Watson, that we're not yet asking the right question. We inquire who removed the ledger and why, but perhaps we should instead ask what the removal of that ledger was meant to accomplish. Was it taken to conceal evidence of a crime, or to prevent a greater injustice from being perpetrated beyond the grave? It was a thought that troubled me deeply, and one that would prove far more prescient than either of us could have anticipated. Chapter 6. Loyalty and Fear. It was during our 6th visit to March House that Holmes requested access to Sir Lionel's correspondence, both personal and professional. Mr. Penbury had arranged the letters in chronological order, and they filled 3 substantial document boxes that had been brought down from the late gentleman's bedchamber. We established ourselves in the library, and for the better part of an afternoon, Holmes worked through the papers with meticulous attention, while I assisted by organising them according to his whispered instructions. The correspondence revealed a man of formidable organisational capacity but limited human warmth. Business letters predominated, written in a hand that was precise to the point of rigidity. Personal communications were rare and invariably brief. What struck me most forcibly was the tone of Sir Lionel's replies to those who had sought his assistance. Each letter of supplication was answered, yet the responses contained no expression of sympathy or understanding. Instead, they laid out terms with legal precision, specifying exactly what would be provided and under what conditions such provision would continue. "Listen to this, Watson," Holmes said, holding up a letter dated some 18 months prior. "It is addressed to Edwin March. Dear Edwin, I acknowledge receipt of your letter of the 15th instant. The matter you describe is indeed serious, and the sum required substantial. I am prepared to discharge your obligations in full on the following understanding: that you will submit to me quarterly accounts of your expenditures and investments for a period of not less than 2 years, during which time you will make no significant financial commitments without my prior approval. Should you fail in this undertaking, I reserve the right to demand immediate repayment of the entire sum advanced. Your obedient servant, Lionel March." "Hardly a warm, familial gesture," I observed. "Note the phrasing, Watson. Not I am happy to assist, but I am prepared to discharge your obligations. Not I hope this will relieve your anxiety, but I reserve the right to demand immediate repayment." Every word calculated to emphasize not generosity, but conditional forbearance. Holmes set aside the letter and extracted another from a different box. And here we have correspondence with Mrs. Corbett's son, young Thomas Corbett, written 3 years ago. "Sir, your mother has appealed to me regarding your recent difficulties, and I have made certain inquiries into the circumstances of your dismissal. Whilst I cannot speak to your guilt or innocence in the matter of the alleged theft, I note that no formal charges have been brought. I am willing to offer you employment in my Manchester office at a salary of £120 per annum, conditional upon your mother's continued service in my household and your own demonstration of absolute probity in all business dealings. Any deviation from the highest standards of conduct will result in immediate dismissal without reference. I trust this arrangement is acceptable." "He used the son's employment to ensure the mother's loyalty," I said, feeling a rising distaste for Sir Lionel's methods. "More than that, Watson. He created a situation where Mrs. Corbett could never leave his service voluntarily, for to do so would be to sacrifice her son's livelihood, and young Thomas could never act independently, knowing that any misstep would reflect upon his mother. Sir Lionel did not merely assist these people, he bound them to him with chains of obligation that were all the stronger for being invisible." We continued through the correspondence, and with each letter the picture grew clearer. "Doctor, Halverson had been retained at a generous fee that was nonetheless renewed annually rather than guaranteed, ensuring his continued attendance even when his medical advice was disregarded. Eleanor March's position in the household was maintained through an allowance that was described in correspondence with Penbury as subject to review should her services prove unsatisfactory. Even the solicitor himself was not exempt from this pattern of calculated dependency. Among the papers, Holmes discovered a letter from Sir Lionel to another law firm, dated 2 years prior, requesting an assessment of their services. Penbury had evidently learned of this inquiry, and had written a rather desperate letter assuring Sir Lionel of his continued dedication and suggesting a reduction in his fees to demonstrate his commitment to the relationship. "He kept them all uncertain, Watson," Holmes murmured as we neared the end of our review. "That was his genius, if one may call it such. He provided material security while withholding emotional assurance. Each person in his orbit had something to lose, and each was reminded regularly that such loss remained a possibility." "It is a monstrous way to treat those dependent upon one," I said with some heat. "Monstrous, perhaps, but not illegal. Sir Lionel broke no laws, violated no contracts. He simply understood that fear of loss is a more powerful motivator than hope of gain, and he exploited that understanding with ruthless efficiency." Holmes rose and walked to the library window, gazing out at the orderly square beyond. "What is absent from this correspondence, Watson, is equally revealing. There are no letters of genuine affection, no expressions of paternal concern, no acknowledgement of service rendered beyond the payment of wages. These people gave Sir Lionel their loyalty, their labour, their very lives in some cases, and he gave them nothing in return but conditional security. Then they all had cause to resent him bitterly. Undoubtedly. Yet resentment alone does not constitute murder, and we have no evidence that Sir Lionel's death was anything other than natural. But the missing ledger, yes, the ledger. That remains our central puzzle. Why would someone remove a document that Sir Lionel himself valued so highly, to conceal evidence of their own obligations? That seems insufficient, for those obligations were already known to the affected parties. To prevent the enforcement of conditions attached to bequests? Perhaps, but that assumes knowledge of what those conditions were. He turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. Unless, Watson, the purpose was not to conceal the past but to liberate the future. Consider. As long as the ledger remains missing, none of these people can be held to whatever term Sir Lionel may have specified. Eleanor inherits without conditions. Edwin owes no further accounting. Mrs. Corbett's son is released from scrutiny. The removal of the ledger effectively nullifies Sir Lionel's control beyond the grave. Then you believe it was taken deliberately to free them all? I believe it was taken by someone who understood that Sir Lionel's true legacy was not his wealth, but his tyranny, and that the ledger was the instrument through which that tyranny would have continued even after his death. Before I could respond, there came a knock upon the library door and Eleanor March entered, her face pale but composed. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, forgive the interruption. Mr. Penbury has sent word that he must speak with you urgently. There has been a development." We found the solicitor in the morning room, his usual composure visibly shaken. He held a letter in his hand, and I observed that his fingers trembled slightly. "Mr. Holmes," said he without preamble, "I have received a communication from the bank that held Sir Lionel's deposit box. It seems that 3 days before his death, Sir Lionel visited the bank and removed certain documents. The clerk recalls him distinctly because Sir Lionel appeared agitated, which was most uncharacteristic. Did the clerk note what documents were removed? He could not say with certainty, but the description matches that of the missing probate ledger. Sir Lionel carried it away in his leather portfolio and signed the register indicating that the box was now empty save for certain securities. Holmes received this intelligence with a sharp intake of breath. That alters matters considerably, Penbury. If Sir Lionel himself removed the ledger from the bank 3 days before his death, then it must have been in his possession when he died, and if it was in his possession, then someone removed it post-mortem. Precisely my conclusion, Mr. Holmes. The locked drawer, the key upon his person, All of it suggests that the ledger was taken after his death, but before the household was fully alerted. The window of opportunity was therefore extremely narrow, between the time of death and the discovery of the body by Mrs. Corbett. A matter of hours, assuming Sir Lionel died during the night as Dr. Halverson has suggested. Holmes was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming upon the arm of his chair in that rhythm which indicated rapid calculation. "I must speak with each member of the household again," he said at length. "But this time, Watson, we shall not inquire about the ledger itself. We shall inquire about the hours between sunset on the 23rd of March and dawn on the 24th. Someone entered that study during the night. Someone who possessed sufficient knowledge of the household to move undetected. Someone who knew where the ledger was kept and had access to the key. But the key was found upon Sir Lionel's person," I protested. "Was it, Watson, or was it replaced there after being used? A subtle distinction, but one that may prove crucial." As we prepared to begin this new line of inquiry, I observed to Holmes that we seemed to be moving further from certainty rather than closer to it. "On the contrary, my dear fellow," he replied. "With each complication, the range of possibilities narrows. We now know that the ledger was taken deliberately, that it was taken shortly after Sir Lionel's death, and that it was taken by someone with intimate knowledge of his habits and household. What we must now determine is which member of that household possessed not merely the opportunity and knowledge, but the particular combination of desperation and resolve necessary to commit such an act." He paused at the library door, his hand upon the knob. "We seek someone who feared the future more than they feared discovery, Watson. Someone for whom the contents of that ledger represented a fate worse than the consequences of theft. When we identify that person, we shall have our answer." Chapter 7. The Convenient Conclusion. I had thought our investigation was entering its most critical phase when, on the morning of our 8th day engaged in the affair, we received an unexpected visitor at Baker Street. Inspector Lestrade arrived shortly after breakfast, his manner betraying that peculiar satisfaction which invariably accompanied what he believed to be a successful resolution of a case. "Good morning, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," said he, removing his bowler and accepting the chair that Holmes indicated. "I trust I find you well. I have come to inform you that the matter of the missing ledger at March House has been satisfactorily resolved. Your services, whilst appreciated, will no longer be required." Holmes, who had been examining the morning's correspondence, set down his letters with deliberate slowness. "Indeed, Lestrade? You have recovered the document?" "Better than that, Mr. Holmes. We have a full confession, Mr. Edwin March presented himself at Scotland Yard yesterday evening and admitted to removing the ledger from his late cousin's study on the night of the 23rd of March. He has provided a complete account of his actions and has agreed to cooperate fully with the disposition of the estate. I confess I was startled by this intelligence, though Holmes's expression revealed nothing beyond polite interest. "How very convenient," said my friend quietly. "Pray tell us the details of this confession, Inspector." Lestrade extracted his notebook and consulted it with evident pleasure. According to Mr. Edwin March, he called upon his cousin on the evening of the 23rd, arriving at approximately 9 o'clock, shortly after the household staff had been dismissed. Sir Lionel received him in the study, where they discussed certain financial matters. During this conversation, Edwin March claims he became aware that Sir Lionel intended to attach stringent conditions to the forgiveness of his debt, conditions that would effectively render him financially dependent for the remainder of his life. "And how did he become aware of these intentions?" Holmes inquired. Sir Lionel showed him the relevant entry in the probate ledger, apparently wishing to impress upon him the seriousness of his expectations. Edwin March states that he was overcome with despair at the prospect of perpetual supervision of his affairs. After Sir Lionel dismissed him, he did not immediately leave the house. Instead, he waited in the entrance hall until he heard his cousin retire to his bedchamber at approximately 11 o'clock. He then returned to the study, where he used the letter opener to force the locked drawer. "One moment, Lestrade," Holmes interrupted. "Edwin March claims to have forced the drawer." "So he states, Mr. Holmes. though I confess the lock showed no signs of such forcing when we examined it. A curious detail. Pray continue. He states that in his agitation, he may have misremembered the precise method by which he opened the drawer. In any event, he removed the ledger with the intention of destroying it, thereby eliminating all record of the conditions his cousin had imposed. He concealed the document about his person and departed the house unobserved. The following day, upon learning of Sir Lionel's death, he realised that removal of the ledger might be construed as theft or worse, but by then he had already destroyed the document. Destroyed it how? Holmes asked. Burned it in the grate of his own lodgings, page by page. A thorough job by his account. Nothing remains but ash. Holmes rose and stood before the window, his back to us both. And what prompted this sudden attack of conscience, Inspector? Why confess now, a full 10 days after the event? He states that the weight of guilt became insupportable, Mr. Holmes. He could not, in good conscience, allow the investigation to continue when he knew himself to be the guilty party. A creditable sentiment, I must say. Quite creditable, Holmes murmured. And the household? How have they received this revelation? With relief, I should say. Miss March in particular appeared most grateful that the matter has been resolved without prolonged scandal. Mr. Penbury has assured me that Edwin March's confession will not materially affect the disposition of the estate, as Sir Lionel's will makes no mention of the conditions described in the ledger. Without that document to enforce them, they are effectively null. How very convenient, Holmes repeated, turning from the window. Tell me, Lestrade, did Edwin March explain how he knew the ledger was kept in the locked drawer of Sir Lionel's desk? Lestrade consulted his notes once more. He states that Sir Lionel removed it from that very drawer during their conversation, thus revealing its location. And did he explain how he knew that Sir Lionel would retire at 11 o'clock, or that the household staff had been dismissed for the evening? Familiarity with his cousin's habits, Mr. Holmes. He had visited the house on numerous occasions. Yet earlier he told us he called upon Sir Lionel only infrequently, and only when invited. The household routines would not have been intimately known to him. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. Perhaps he was more familiar with the household than he initially admitted. In any case, Mr. Holmes, we have a confession. The man has admitted his guilt. What more would you require? Holmes returned to his chair and regarded the inspector with an expression that mingled amusement and something approaching pity. What I would require, Lestrade, is some semblance of logical consistency. Edwin March's confession is admirably complete in its details, yet those details do not cohere. He forces a lock that shows no sign of forcing. He knows the precise location of a document he claims to have seen only briefly during a distressing conversation. He waits in the entrance hall of a house whose staff has been dismissed, yet fears no discovery. He destroys a ledger whose contents would have liberated not merely himself but every member of Sir Lionel's circle. Yet he acts alone and tells no one. It is, in short, precisely the sort of confession one would construct if one wished to resolve an inconvenient investigation whilst concealing the actual truth. You believe he is lying? Lestrade asked incredulously. I believe he is protecting someone, Inspector. The question is whom and why. But he has provided details that only the guilty party could know. On the contrary, he has provided details that anyone familiar with the household could have supplied, are carefully edited to exclude anything that might lead us toward the genuine culprit. It is a noble gesture, perhaps, but it is not the truth. Lestrade rose, his face flushed with indignation. Mr. Holmes, with all respect to your methods, Scotland Yard cannot simply dismiss a voluntary confession because it strikes you as too convenient. Edwin March has admitted his guilt in the presence of witnesses and has provided a coherent account of his actions. That is sufficient for our purposes. Then you intend to close the investigation? I do, sir. The matter is resolved. I came here as a courtesy, to inform you that your services are no longer required. Good day to you both. After the inspector had departed, I ventured to ask Holmes whether he truly believed Edwin March innocent of the theft. I believe he is guilty of many things. Hey, Watson, but the removal of that ledger is not among them. His confession is too pat, too complete, and too carefully constructed to exclude certain salient facts. Moreover, it serves a purpose that has nothing to do with justice and everything to do with protecting someone he cares for deeply. Eleanor March? Almost certainly. Consider the sequence of events as Edwin describes them. He arrives uninvited at 9 o'clock, is received by Sir Lionel despite the late hour, is shown the ledger, is dismissed, yet lingers in the house for 2 hours before committing his theft. It is absurd. If he had truly wished to steal the ledger, he would have done so immediately upon being shown its location, and not waited until his cousin had retired. Then who did take it? Holmes walked to the mantelpiece and stood gazing at the Persian slipper where he kept his tobacco. Someone who had both opportunity and desperate need, Watson. Someone who understood that the ledger represented not merely financial conditions, but a form of posthumous tyranny that would blight their entire future. Someone who could move through the house undetected because they belonged there. You suspect Miss March herself? I more than suspect, Watson. I am nearly certain. But suspicion and certainty are useless without proof, and Edwin March's confession has effectively eliminated any prospect of obtaining such proof. The household will close ranks, Lestrade will close the case, and the truth will remain forever obscured beneath a veil of expedient lies. He turned to face me, and I was struck by the unusual expression of frustration upon his features. We have been outmanoeuvred, my dear fellow, not by a criminal of exceptional cunning, but by ordinary people acting in concert to protect one another. It is almost admirable in its way. Almost. Then what do you propose to do? What I have done from the beginning, Watson. Observe, deduce, and wait for the one detail that will unravel the entire carefully constructed fabric. For there is always such a detail. Always, and I believe I know what it is. He would say nothing more on the subject that morning, but I observed that he spent the afternoon reviewing his notes from our various visits to March House, yet occasionally pausing to underline certain passages or annotate them with cryptic symbols. Whatever he had perceived, it remained for the moment beyond my own powers of observation. The case, it seemed, was far from concluded, regardless of what Scotland Yard might believe. Chapter 8. The Overlooked Detail. For 3 days following Lestrade's visit, Holmes remained in a state of intense preoccupation. He spoke little, ate less, and spent long hours seated motionless in his chair, his eyes closed and his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. I had witnessed such periods of intense cerebration before, and knew better than to disturb him with questions or conversation. On the 4th day, he emerged abruptly from this trance-like state and announced his intention to return to March House. "There is something I must verify." "Watson," said he, reaching for his coat, "a detail so apparently insignificant that I nearly overlooked it myself, yet I believe it holds the key to understanding not merely what occurred, but when it occurred." "You have discovered something in your notes?" "Not discovered, Watson, but rather recognized the significance of something I observed during our very first examination of the study. Come, we have not a moment to lose. I must see that room again before my hypothesis solidifies into premature certainty." We arrived at Cavendish Square within the hour. The household received us with evident surprise, as we had not announced our visit. Miss Eleanor March appeared particularly disconcerted by our presence, though she maintained her characteristic composure. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," said she, meeting us in the entrance hall. "I confess I did not expect to see you again. Inspector Lestrade assured us that the matter was concluded." "The inspector's conclusions are his own, Miss March," Holmes replied evenly. "I have 1 or 2 small points that require clarification. If you would permit me to examine the study once more, I shall trouble you no further." She hesitated for the briefest moment before acquiescing. "Of course, though I cannot imagine what remains to be discovered. Everything is precisely as it was." "That, Miss March, is precisely what concerns me." We entered the study, and Holmes proceeded directly to the desk. He stood for several moments regarding the inkstand with that peculiar intensity which characterized his most significant observations. Then, with great care, he lifted the crystal vessel and examined it against the light from the window. Mrs. Corbett stated that she fills this inkstand every Monday without fail, he said, more to himself than to me. The 20th of March was indeed a Monday. Sir Lionel died on the night of the 23rd, which was a Thursday. His body was discovered on the morning of Friday the 24th. He removed the stopper and peered into the reservoir with his lens. Watson, you will recall that when we first examined this study, I inquired about Sir Lionel's writing habits. You did. Mrs. Corbett confirmed that he wrote every evening without fail. Precisely. Letters, diary entries, notations in various ledgers. A man of methodical habits who documented his affairs with obsessive thoroughness. And now observe. He tilted the inkstand so that I might see its interior. What do you make of the ink level? I examined the vessel carefully. The ink appeared nearly depleted, with perhaps sufficient quantity for a few lines of writing at most. It is very low, I observed, almost empty. Exactly so, Watson. Now consider. Mrs. Corbett filled this inkstand on Monday the 20th. Sir Lionel wrote by all accounts for at least an hour each evening, Monday evening, Tuesday evening, Wednesday evening, and finally Thursday evening, the night of his death. 4 sessions of extensive writing from a freshly filled inkstand. What does that suggest to you? I considered the matter carefully. That he must have written a considerable quantity to deplete the reservoir so thoroughly. Or, Watson, that the final entry was not written on Thursday evening at all, but some days earlier. The significance of this observation struck me immediately. You believe the last entry in the ledger was written before the night of his death? I believe it more than possible, my dear fellow. Mr. Penbury told us that the final entry in the ledger, as he recalled it from his last viewing, bore the date of March 23rd. But what if that entry was written not on the 23rd, but earlier, and the date was merely inscribed to create the appearance of recent composition? To what purpose? That, Watson, is what we must determine. Holmes moved to the windows, examining the eastern casement with renewed attention. He tested the catch mechanism, studied the frame, and finally stood gazing out at the square beyond. A window left unlatched on a cold evening, he murmured. A decanter of port poured but not consumed. Papers arranged with geometric precision. An inkstand nearly empty, and a body positioned as though carefully composed for viewing. Each detail individually insignificant, yet collectively they suggest a narrative quite different from the one we have been presented. He turned abruptly and addressed Eleanor March, who had remained in the doorway observing our investigation with evident anxiety. Miss March, I must ask you a question of some delicacy. On the evening of March 20th, that would be the Monday preceding your uncle's death, did you have occasion to enter this study? The colour drained from her face, and for a moment I thought she might refuse to answer. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. I did, Mr. Holmes. Uncle Lionel had requested certain household accounts, which I brought to him that evening. And during that visit did you observe him writing in the probate ledger? Her hands tightened upon the doorframe. I may have. I cannot recall with certainty. Come now, Miss March. A ledger of such significance would surely have attracted your notice. Did you see it upon his desk? Yes, she whispered. Yes, I saw it. He was making entries, updating certain notations. And did he discuss the contents with you? No, he closed it when I entered and locked it in the drawer. He said nothing of its contents. Holmes nodded slowly, as though some internal calculation had been confirmed. Yet you knew, did you not, that it contained conditions affecting your inheritance? Or you suspected that your uncle intended to control your future even from beyond the grave? Eleanor March's composure finally shattered. She sank into one of the leather chairs, her face in her hands. I suspected, she said, her voice breaking. How could I not suspect? Everything Uncle Lionel did was calculated to maintain control, to ensure compliance. Why should his final dispositions be any different? And when did you learn the actual contents of the ledger, Miss March? She looked up at Holmes, her eyes bright with tears that she struggled to contain. I did not learn them, Mr. Holmes. I never saw the ledger again after that evening. I know nothing of what it contained. Yet someone removed it from this study on the night your uncle died. Someone who had access to the key, knowledge of the household, and desperate need to prevent those contents from ever being revealed. Edwin has confessed to the theft, she said, a note of defiance entering her voice. The matter is concluded. Edwin March has sacrificed himself to protect you, Miss March. That much is evident. But his confession cannot alter the facts as they present themselves to careful observation. The inkstand tells a story that Edwin's account cannot accommodate. Your uncle did not write in that ledger on the night of his death. The final entry was made days earlier, yet the scene was arranged to suggest otherwise. Why would someone stage such a deception, unless there was something more than simple theft to conceal? Eleanor March rose unsteadily, gripping the back of the chair for support. I have nothing more to say, Mr. Holmes. If you wish to question me further, you must do so through a solicitor. I wish only to understand the truth, Miss March, not to condemn but to comprehend. Your uncle died of heart failure. That much is not in dispute. But the circumstances surrounding his death, the careful arrangement of the study, the missing ledger, these things suggest that someone was present when he died, or immediately thereafter. Someone who had reason to fear what the ledger contained an opportunity to remove it. She stood silent, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. I will tell you this much, Mr. Holmes, she said at length. My uncle was not the man the world believed him to be. He was not generous, or kind, or fair. He was a tyrant who ruled through fear disguised as beneficence. And if that ledger has been destroyed, then perhaps some small justice has been served, even if the law recognises no crime. With that she turned and left the study, leaving Holmes and myself alone in the chamber that had witnessed Sir Lionel March's final hours. You have shaken her, Holmes, I observed, but you are no closer to proof. On the contrary, Watson, I am very close indeed. The inkstand has told me when the crucial events occurred. Now I need only establish the sequence of those events and the identity of the person who set them in motion, and for that I must speak once more with Dr. Halverson. There is a medical question that requires clarification. What question is that? Holmes gathered his hat and stick, his expression grim. The question, my dear Watson, of precisely when Sir Lionel March breathed his last, and whether death came to him as peacefully as we have been led to believe. Chapter 9. The Truth Revealed. We found Dr. Halverson at his consulting rooms in Wimpole Street, where he received us with barely concealed irritation. He was between patients, he informed us curtly, and could spare no more than 10 minutes for our inquiries. This matter should be concluded, Mr. Holmes, said he, gesturing for us to take seats. Edwin March has confessed to the theft of the ledger. What more requires discussion? A medical question, Doctor, relating to the precise timing of Sir Lionel's death. You certified that he died of heart failure during the night of March 23rd. I did, and I stand by that certification. Based upon what evidence? Halverson's expression hardened. Based upon 30 years of medical practice, Mr. Holmes. Sir Lionel exhibited no signs of trauma. His colour, his temperature, the positioning of his body, all were consistent with cardiac arrest occurring during sleep or quiet repose. You examined him when, precisely? Mrs. Corbett sent for me at approximately 7:30 on the morning of the 24th. I arrived within 20 minutes and pronounced him deceased. The body had begun to cool but was not yet in full rigour. I estimated death had occurred between 4 and 6 hours prior. That is to say, sometime between 1 and 3 o'clock in the morning. Holmes leaned forward in his chair. Could you determine, with any precision, whether death had been instantaneous or prolonged? The peaceful aspect of the body suggested a relatively sudden cessation of cardiac function, yet there was no evidence of struggle or distress. And if I were to suggest to you, Doctor, that Sir Lionel did not die peacefully in his sleep, but rather during a moment of acute emotional shock, would that be consistent with your findings? Halverson was silent for a long moment. It might be, he admitted reluctantly. A severe emotional shock could indeed precipitate cardiac arrest in a man of Sir Lionel's age and condition, but I observed no evidence to support such a conclusion. Because, Doctor, you were not looking for it. You saw what you expected to see, an elderly man who had died of natural causes in the night. But consider, if Sir Lionel had experienced a sudden shock, his heart had failed, and he had then been carefully repositioned to create the appearance of peaceful death. Would you have detected the difference? The doctor's face had grown pale. Are you suggesting that someone was present when he died? That someone arranged the scene to conceal the circumstances? I am suggesting precisely that, Doctor, and I believe you suspected as much from the beginning, though you chose not to pursue the matter. That is a serious accusation, Mr. Holmes. It is an observation, Doctor, not an accusation. You are a skilled physician who has pronounced death on countless occasions. The scene in that study was too perfect, too carefully composed. Yet you certified natural causes and asked no questions. Why? Halverson rose and walked to his consulting room window, his back to us. Because Sir Lionel March was a difficult man, Mr. Holmes, he said quietly. Because his death, however it came, was not unjust. Because those he left behind deserved the chance to live free of his influence. I saw no evidence of foul play, no poison, no violence, no crime that I could identify. I saw only an old man who had died, and a household that might finally know peace. Thank you for your candour, Doctor. You have confirmed what I suspected. That evening, Holmes sent word to March House requesting that all parties concerned assemble in the study at 9 o'clock. Mr. Penbury, Eleanor March, Edwin March, Mrs. Corbett, and Dr. Halverson gathered in that solemn chamber, their faces betraying varying degrees of apprehension and defiance. Holmes stood before the fireplace, his profile sharp in the lamplight, and began his exposition in that clear, measured tone which I had heard him employ so many times before. "We have been engaged in this investigation for nearly a fortnight," said he, "and throughout that time we have laboured under a fundamental misapprehension. We have sought to identify who removed the probate ledger from this study, when the more pertinent question was why it needed to be removed at all. The answer to that question requires us to reconstruct not merely the events of March 23rd, but those of several days prior." He moved to the desk and placed his hand upon the inkstand. "This vessel told me the first crucial truth. It was filled on Monday the 20th and should have contained sufficient ink for several days of Sir Lionel's habitual writing. Yet when we first examined it, the reservoir was nearly depleted. That could only mean that Sir Lionel had engaged in unusually extensive writing during the interval, or that his final entry in the ledger, supposedly made on Thursday the 23rd, was in fact written days earlier." Eleanor March had grown very still, her hands folded tightly in her lap. On Monday evening, March 20th, Sir Lionel sat in this study and updated his probate ledger. He made careful notations regarding the disposition of his estate, including certain conditions that would govern the inheritances of those dependent upon him. Miss Eleanor March brought him household accounts that evening and observed him at this work, though she did not see the specific contents of his notations. Holmes paused, his gaze moving to Eleanor. "What you did not tell us, Miss March, was that your uncle summoned you back to this study on the evening of Wednesday the 22nd. Is that not correct?" Eleanor's voice, when it came, was barely audible. "It is correct." "And during that interview, he informed you of the contents of the ledger as they pertained to your inheritance. Would you tell us what he said?" She raised her eyes to meet Holmes's gaze, and I saw in them a mixture of anguish and defiance. "He told me that I would inherit the house and a modest annuity, but only on condition that I never marry. He said that I had proven myself capable of managing his household, and he wished me to continue managing it in perpetuity, as a memorial to his memory. If I should marry or even form a serious attachment, the entire estate would pass to charitable institutions." A collective intake of breath greeted this revelation. "He wished to control you even from the grave," Holmes said quietly, "to ensure that you remained forever as you were, unmarried, a dependent, bound to this house and his memory. He said it was for my own protection, Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger. He said that marriage would only expose me to fortune hunters and disappointment. He believed he was being generous, providing for me whilst protecting me from my own foolishness. And your response to this pronouncement? I told him that I had already formed an attachment, that a gentleman had expressed interest in marriage, and that I intended to accept his proposal. Edwin March, Holmes said, glancing at the cousin who sat with his head bowed. Yes, Eleanor confirmed. Edwin and I had grown close during his visits to this house. He's a good man who made mistakes, but Uncle Lionel's assistance had given him the opportunity to redeem himself. We had not yet spoken openly of marriage, but we had an understanding. And Sir Lionel's reaction to this disclosure? Eleanor's hands trembled as she spoke. He flew into a rage such as I had never witnessed. He said that Edwin was unworthy, that the attachment was mercenary, that I had betrayed his trust and generosity. He said he would not merely disinherit me, he would ensure that Edwin's debts were called in immediately, that he would be ruined completely. He reached for the ledger, intending to make these revisions then and there. And then he clutched at his chest. His face went grey. He struggled to rise from his chair but fell back. I called his name, but he did not respond. His eyes were open, staring at me, and then they were not. The room had fallen into complete silence. Sam, even the fire seemed to burn more quietly as Eleanor March completed her account. I stood there for I know not how long, she continued, her voice breaking. I thought perhaps I should summon help, but it was too late. He was gone, and I realized that if that ledger remained, his tyranny would continue. Even in death he would control my life, Edwin's life, all of us. So I took the key from his watch chain. I unlocked the drawer, I removed the ledger and concealed it in my rooms. And then you arranged the study to appear as though he had died peacefully during the night, Holmes concluded. I did. I positioned him carefully in his chair. I aligned the papers on his desk. I poured port into the decanter to suggest he had been preparing to retire. I left the window unlatched to provide fresh air for the room. And I returned to my chambers and waited until morning when Mrs. Corbett made a discovery. Holmes turned to face the assembled company. Miss March did not murder her uncle. She did not strike him, or poison him, or do him any violence. She merely told him a truth he could not bear to hear, and his own heart failed him. What followed was not murder, but a desperate attempt to free herself and others from a posthumous tyranny that would have blighted multiple lives. And the ledger, Mr. Penbury asked quietly. Destroyed, I imagine. Burned page by page, its ashes scattered, its contents lost forever. Eleanor nodded confirmation. Edwin March rose and crossed to Eleanor's side, taking her hand in his. I offered my confession to protect her, he said. I would do so again. Eleanor acted not from malice, but from desperation born of my uncle's cruelty. Holmes regarded them both with an expression I found difficult to interpret. The law will judge your actions, Miss March. I cannot predict what that judgment will be. But I can say this. Your uncle died of heart failure brought on by emotional shock. You did not kill him, though you witnessed his death. What you did afterward, the removal of the ledger, the arrangement of the scene, these were acts of self-preservation in the face of intolerable circumstances. He turned to Dr. Halverson. And you, Doctor, must decide whether to amend your certification or allow it to stand as written. The physician met Holmes's gaze steadily. I certified that Sir Lionel March died of heart failure during the night of March 23rd. That certification was accurate in all material particulars. I see no reason to alter it. Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgement and gathered his hat and stick. Then my work here is concluded. The truth has been revealed, and justice, whatever form it may take, must run its course. Chapter 10. The Weight of Justice. The days following Holmes's revelation passed with a slowness that seemed almost deliberate, as though time itself wished to allow for careful consideration of all that had been disclosed. Eleanor March did not flee, nor did she seek to retract her account. Instead, she remained at March House, continuing her duties with that same measured composure that had characterised her throughout our investigation, though I fancied I detected a subtle alteration in her bearing, a quality of quiet relief perhaps, at having finally spoken the truth. Mr. Penbury consulted with various legal authorities regarding the proper course of action. The matter was delicate in the extreme, touching as it did upon questions of inheritance, truthfulness in death certification, and the concealment of material facts. Yet, as the solicitor carefully pointed out, no crime of violence had been committed. Sir Lionel March had died of natural causes, however much emotional distress might have contributed to the timing of his demise. It was on a grey morning, some 10 days after Holmes's exposition, that we received word that a decision had been reached. We were requested to attend a private meeting at Mr. Penbury's chambers, where all interested parties would gather to hear the resolution. The solicitor's offices in Lincoln's Inn Fields were sober and dignified, befitting a practice of long-standing and impeccable reputation. We were shown into a conference room where Eleanor March sat beside Edwin, her hand resting lightly in his. Mrs. Corbett occupied a chair near the window, her expression carefully neutral. Dr. Halverson stood apart from the others, his arms folded across his chest. Mr. Penbury entered carrying several documents, which he placed upon the table before taking his seat. "Thank you all for attending," he began, his voice carrying that particular solemnity which significant pronouncements require. "I have consulted extensively with counsel regarding the circumstances surrounding Sir Lionel March's death and the subsequent removal of his probate ledger. The legal position is complex, but I believe we have arrived at a resolution that serves both justice and mercy." He paused to arrange his papers with characteristic precision. "First, regarding the certification of death, Dr. Halverson's original determination that Sir Lionel died of heart failure during the night of March 23rd remains accurate in all material respects. The emotional distress that precipitated the cardiac event does not alter the medical cause of death. No amendment to the certification is required or advisable." Dr. Halverson inclined his head in acknowledgement but said nothing. "Second, regarding the probate ledger. Its removal from Sir Lionel's study constituted technically an interference with estate administration. However, the conditions described in that ledger were never properly incorporated into Sir Lionel's last will and testament. As such, they possessed no legal force. The ledger was a private memorandum, nothing more. Its absence, whilst regrettable from an administrative perspective, does not materially affect the disposition of the estate as outlined in the properly executed will." Eleanor March's hand tightened upon Edwin's, though her expression remained composed. "Third, regarding Miss March's actions following her uncle's death. She is admitted to arranging the study to create a misleading impression of the circumstances. She is admitted to removing the ledger with intent to destroy it. These actions, whilst not constituting criminal conduct in the strictest sense, represent a failure of candour that cannot be overlooked. Mr. Penbury looked directly at Eleanor as he continued. "However, counsel has advised that prosecution would serve no useful purpose. Sir Lionel's death was natural. The estate can be properly administered without the ledger, and Miss March has cooperated fully once the truth was established. It is therefore recommended that no formal charges be pursued." I observed Eleanor's shoulders relax slightly, though she maintained her dignified posture. "That said," Penbury continued, "certain consequences must follow. Miss March, you will inherit the estate as specified in your uncle's will, free of the conditions he attempted to impose through his private ledger. However, you must understand that your actions, understandable though they may have been, reflect a willingness to manipulate truth for personal advantage. I say this not to condemn you, but to ensure you comprehend the gravity of what occurred." "I do comprehend it, Mr. Penbury," Eleanor replied quietly. "I have lived with that understanding every day since my uncle's death. I do not claim innocence, only desperation." Edwin March spoke for the first time. "The fault was not Eleanor's alone. I encouraged her attachment, knowing that it would place her in conflict with Sir Lionel's expectations. If blame is to be assigned, I must share it. The assignment of blame is not our purpose here, Penbury said. Our purpose is resolution. To that end, I have one final matter to address. He extracted a document from his portfolio and placed it before Eleanor. The estate, once administered, will provide you with substantial independent means, Miss March. I have taken the liberty of drafting a proposal whereby a significant portion of those means, 20% of the total value, would be directed toward a charitable trust established in your uncle's name. The trust would provide assistance to young men and women facing financial difficulties, offering aid without the conditions and controls that characterize Sir Lionel's private beneficence. Eleanor studied the document carefully before raising her eyes to meet the solicitor's gaze. You propose to extract good from my uncle's legacy despite his own intentions. I propose to honour what was best in him whilst rejecting what was worst. Sir Lionel had the means and the inclination to assist others. He lacked only the generosity of spirit to do so without extracting tribute in return. This trust would correct that deficiency. I accept your proposal, Mr. Penbury. It is more than fair. As the meeting concluded and the various parties began to depart, Holmes drew Mr. Penbury aside for a private word. I could not hear their conversation, but I observed the solicitor's expression shift from professional reserve to something approaching relief. Later, as we made our way back to Baker Street through streets grown damp with the first intimations of rain, I ventured to ask Holmes what he had said to Penbury. I merely expressed my appreciation for his handling of a delicate matter, Holmes replied. He could have pursued prosecution. The law would have supported such action, however harsh it might have seemed. Instead, he chose a resolution that acknowledged wrongdoing whilst recognising the moral complexity of the circumstances. It was, I think, the wisest course available. You approve, then? Holmes was silent for several moments, his keen eyes watching the passing traffic. I approve of outcomes that serve justice without sacrificing humanity, Watson. Eleanor March acted wrongly in concealing the circumstances of her uncle's death. That cannot be denied. Yet she acted from desperation born of intolerable tyranny. Sir Lionel March controlled lives through the manipulation of dependency and fear. His death freed those lives, and the destruction of his ledger ensured that freedom would endure. Was that wrong? Legally, perhaps? Morally? I am less certain. But you revealed the truth nonetheless. Because truth matters, Watson. We're not as an absolute to which all other considerations must bow, but as a foundation upon which just outcomes must be built. Had Eleanor's actions remained concealed, the household would have lived forever under the shadow of deception. Edwin's false confession would have marked him unjustly. The actual circumstances would have festered in memory, distorting relationships and breeding guilt. By bringing the truth to light, I enabled a resolution grounded in understanding rather than expedience. We had reached Baker Street, and as we climbed the familiar stairs to our rooms, I found myself reflecting upon the case with an emotion I had rarely experienced at the conclusion of Holmes's investigations, not satisfaction at justice served, but a more complex sense of having witnessed the accommodation of human frailty within the framework of law. Mrs. Hudson had laid a fire, and Holmes settled into his chair with evident relief at returning to familiar surroundings. I took my own accustomed seat and reached for my notebook, intending to record the final details of the case whilst they remained fresh in memory. You will write this up, I suppose, Holmes remarked, his eyes already half closed in contemplation. I shall, though I confess the narrative lacks the clear resolution of some of our other adventures. Life, my dear Watson, rarely provides clear resolutions. It offers instead accommodations between competing claims, justice and mercy, truth and compassion, individual rights and collective welfare. The art lies in finding the accommodation that does the least harm while serving the greatest good. And in this case, a woman who suffered under tyranny will inherit the means to live freely. A man who offered himself for her sake will be spared the consequences of false confession. a household that existed in perpetual fear will know peace, and a ledger designed to extend one man's control beyond the grave has been reduced to ash, its tyrannical contents lost forever. That seems to me as good an accommodation as could reasonably be hoped for. He opened his eyes and regarded me with that penetrating gaze which had unravelled so many mysteries. But record it faithfully, Watson. Record both the crime and the compassion, the deception and the desperation. Record that Eleanor March was not innocent, but neither was she entirely guilty. Record that justice saw clearly but was not blind to suffering, for therein lies the true resolution of the case, not in punishment or absolution, but in understanding. I have endeavoured to follow Holmes's instruction in setting down this account. The case of the missing probate ledger was never officially concluded, never entered into Scotland Yard's records as solved. Edwin March's confession was quietly withdrawn. Eleanor March inherited her uncle's estate, and the charitable trust was duly established. In time, I learned that Eleanor and Edwin did indeed marry, and that they departed London for a quiet life in the countryside, far from Cavendish Square and the house where Sir Lionel March had exercised his subtle tyranny. The March house itself was eventually sold, and I understand it is now occupied by a family of quite different character. As for Holmes, he spoke little of the case in subsequent years, though I observed that he clipped and retained the announcement of the March Charitable Trust's establishment, tucking it into his commonplace book among other matters of interest. When I asked him why he preserved this particular notice, he replied simply, "Because it represents something rare, Watson, a case where the revelation of truth led not to punishment, but to redemption. Such outcomes are worth remembering, and so I have remembered it, and now I have recorded it, that others might judge for themselves whether justice was truly served in the affair of Sir Lionel March and the hidden probate ledger.